Hello YouTube, welcome back to BrungerBuilds. Today, I'll be kit bashing an original astromech droid design using the world's smallest working shop vac. Alright, I'd like to say a quick thank you to Brian from the Smuggler's room for challenging me with this build. I will admit that when he first pitched me the idea, I was a little intimidated at the thought of having to build a full-scale droid, and so I opted to go the smaller route. But because I didn't want to break the rules completely, I made sure that the shop vac I bought still functioned as a shop vac. Well, kind of. After disassembling the shop vac, I played with the orientation of the main body parts a bit, and then filled the wheel holes with milliput, and then moved on to the brainstorming stage. I also preemptively bought this tank and lathe model kit in the hopes that I could use the tiny little pieces for greeblies on the droid. I did also end up using a few 3D models, and I'll try my best to remember to link those in the description. I also dug through my junk boxes in the hopes that I might find a piece or two that would give me a rough silhouette or design idea that might set me on the right path. Initially, I thought I might go with something that looked a bit like the R1 series astromech droid, but I couldn't quite get anything to look the way I wanted it to, and ultimately I scrapped that idea. It wasn't until I came across these two Mando ears that I really felt like I was on the right track. Something about the U shape in the center of the ears, mimicking the sort of rounded area that would later become the eye, and the rounded areas at the top of the head, made the whole thing feel very cohesive from the start. Also, the width of the two ears put together perfectly matched the width of one of my tank treads from my model kit. I did feel like the ears were a bit too big overall though, and so using Blender, I shrunk them down a bit and combined them with a BD1 leg just to add a bit more detail. Sticking to that initial idea of a sort of rounded design, I modeled up this visor and eye socket in Blender. I also played with the position of the eye socket and ultimately decided on the lower position, since I felt like it gave the droid a slightly stockier, compact feel. Somewhere along the line, I laid down this Cal Kestis lightsaber shroud piece on the body of the droid. And again, something about those rounded angles really fit well in the overall design. And I really liked the way it made the droid look like he was wearing an overcoat. And it was at this point I decided that it would be some sort of reconnaissance or trailblazer droid. And just for fun, I established its scale in universe. And so from this point on, I knew that I was building a 1/10 scale reconnaissance droid. After finishing the rough design of my droid, I felt a little bad that I had two pieces of the shop vac sitting unused. And because this was a shop vac build challenge, I decided I needed to expand the scope of this project and turn the whole thing into a diorama. Thus, the idea of these two moisture evaporators were born. Moisture evaporators, control towers, power cells, I don't exactly know what they are. I just knew I wanted them to look cool. And now for a little trick I learned from watching Ray Studio modeling on Instagram. I didn't know about this until very recently, but this technique is a great way to give your models extra panel lining. As you can see, my first attempt was pretty sloppy, but it gets the point across. And here are the finished Vaporators. I also built this exhaust fan using a broken cooling fan from one of my 3D printer heads. And the last thing I built was this panel that I planned to mount into one of the walls of the diorama. And after a quick coat of primer and paint, it was time for the terrain. Before building up the terrain, I laid out all my parts just to make sure I had enough room for everything. And then it was on to adding a bit more foam and plaster rocks to build up the terrain. I used my hot wire knife to cut some grooves in the foam where I knew the walkway would be, and then used a wire brush to smooth out the walkway before adding DIY Sculpt-A-Mold. I wish I could remember who I learned this recipe from, but it's just blended toilet paper mixed with matte Mod Podge, PVA glue, plaster, and a little bit of paint. Mix it together until you've got a peanut butter consistency, and then spread it in all the gaps. To give the ground some texture, I mixed up some sand with some matte Mod Podge, PVA glue, and black paint. I then wrapped my pieces in plastic and stuck them down so that overnight the mixture would dry, and in the morning I'd be left with a perfect little spot for each of my pieces to go back to. The next day, once everything had dried, I hit the base with a zenithal highlight. This helps emphasize shadow detail. For this next step, I probably used more color washes than I needed to, but when it comes to painting something out in nature, I've always found that it's better to use more tones than not enough. That's because out in nature, something like a rock is never truly just one or two colors. There's always a massive tonal variation across the surface of the rock. And so doing it this way is the best way I've found to make my rock look as real as possible. There's no one set way to do this, and it really just depends on what type of rock you're trying to imitate, but as you can see here, I first started with a random splattering of my lightest colors, and then covered that with a gray wash. From there I added some browns, some greens, and covered that in a black wash. Once those washes were dry, I hit the edges of the rock with a gray dry brush, and then went back over everything with a very light dry brush of a light gray that's almost white, in order to highlight the very tips of the edges of all the rock. I originally painted the door with an orangish brown color, but decided that looked too much like Tatooine, so I covered it up with a bluish gray. I painted the wall panel using a couple different tones of Vallejo's metal color, and then painted the doorway tile and the exhaust fan. As I was tinkering with the droid and the greeblies that I had on hand, I pretty quickly realized that if I wanted this to feel like an astromech droid, I needed some astromech parts. This Bondi kit was great and came with a bunch of really awesome details, but I just couldn't get the R2 body to work with my droid, so I ended up tweaking a model in Blender and printing that. To fill in the seams between the two parts, I used Milliput epoxy putty and then sanded it down once it was dry. It was at this point I decided to give the droid some antennas, and the Bondi holoprojector lenses didn't quite work, so I resin printed those too. I decided I wanted to place this little panel on the side of the droid's eye, and so I taped up a little rectangle, and after a very slow process of scribing, I finally cut a perfectly sized hole. I then used that same technique to add a few more greeblies to the top of his head. One of the things that I really wanted to make work on this droid was to add a working light panel on the back side of his head like you see on all astromech droids. So to do that, I spent $30 on this sheet of brass to get this one tiny panel that I thought would work perfectly. I used my scribing tape to cut another perfect rectangle in the side of his head, and I was really happy with the way everything was turning out. I also used my scribe tool to inlay a few greeblies and add some panel lines. Now here's another trick I learned from Ray Studio Modeling over on Instagram. I drilled a hole just big enough for a piece of transparent sprue. I then used a slightly bigger drill to countersink that hole. And then after sanding the end of the sprue round, I could then install the sprue and have another blinking light in the side of the droid's head. At least that was the idea, since I didn't know if I could make that work yet. Here you can see almost everything I did to the top of the head. To get the droid's overcoat to work, I used my Silhouette Cameo 4 to first scribe panel lines into a sheet of styrene, and then to cut it out. I also cut out a few spots where some of the Bondi model kit pieces would sit. I printed out this little form so that I could heat up the styrene and have it cool in a perfect cylinder, and then glued it to the droid body. I was feeling like the top of the droid's head could use a bit more detail, and so using my Cameo 4, I cut out another stencil on some styrene so that I could scribe along the edges of the styrene. I also used my tiny little drill to countersink a couple details. Fun little fact, this panel lining is based off of the round panel lines on BB-8's ball. And here is the primed droid body. For the metal parts on the droid, I used Vallejo's chrome metal color over a gloss black base, and I was very surprised with how shiny the metal color was. I also did a quick metal dry brush on the tank treads. As I worked my way through different parts of the build, a story was slowly starting to take shape. In my opinion, even the roughest outline of a story is incredibly helpful when it comes to knowing what direction to head for the final product. A story can influence anything from the amount of weathering you might do to a specific part, or even dictate the colors you choose for a character. And in my case, my rough outline went something like this. I knew that I wanted this planet to be densely forested and very muddy. Think Endor if it rained all the time. And on this planet was an abandoned Imperial base. And for some reason or another, this Recon droid had been stuck there for years and years and years. So I wanted the machinery to be heavily damaged from the elements. I wanted there to be rust everywhere, and armor left behind by the stormtroopers. And then to contrast all this decay, I wanted it to feel like the forest was reclaiming the base, slowly swallowing it up with new growth and greenery everywhere. Here you can see I modified another piece of the Cal Kestis lightsaber files to create internals for one of my Vaporator towers. The idea was that even though the base was crumbling into disrepair, the droid was maintaining a few critical energy systems to keep himself alive. For Christmas, one of my family members gifted me The Wildlife of Star Wars, a field guide. This book was published sometime in the early 2000s after the release of The Phantom Menace, and is chock full of beautiful hand-drawn artwork of creatures throughout the Star Wars galaxy. If you're at all a fan of Star Wars creature design or concept art, I highly recommend you pick this book up, and I think it can be found for pretty cheaply online. Anyway, reading through the book inspired me to create a few creatures for my diorama, but because I'm a terrible 3D modeler, I resorted to my usual method of digital kit bashing. I took this sugar glider model into Blender, and I stretched its ears and gave it 4 ears because I felt like that looked a bit more alien. I stretched its snout a bit and put a pig nose right at the tip of his nose. And because there was no fur texture on the model, I used some Vallejo's modeling putty to add a bit of texture. I didn't quite know what colors to pick for the creature just yet, so I gave one of the models to my son and asked him how he would paint it, and he gave me this. So I took that and did my best to replicate it while keeping it a bit more realistic. I really liked the black stripe he gave across the eyes, and so I made sure to include that. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I am not a very good model painter, and so I definitely took plenty of time being very intentional about the placement of my colors. Again, because I was working with something I wanted to feel natural, I was using 5 or 6 different tones of browns, oranges, and grays, and I was doing my best to wet blend most of the colors to give them a more organic appearance. To mimic shadows, I made sure the darker colors were on the underside of his body, and then the lighter colors were along the ridges of his back and legs and ears. Once I was basically happy with the placement of all the colors, I hit the whole thing with a light gray and light orange dry brush to bring out the edges of all the fur texture. I then painted his eyes black and covered them in a little dab of gloss varnish, which I feel like went a long way towards making the creature feel alive. I also gave them a little nest using some thin gauge wire, spray adhesive, and some ground up dry brush. A good friend of mine suggested I add some birds, and so in Blender I threw together a model of a blue jay and a capybara, just to make it feel a bit more alien. I painted these up pretty quickly, and I will say I'm a bit less proud of this paint job than the last one, but it gets the point across. Alright, now that I had a better idea of the direction I wanted the diorama to go in, it was time to make that a reality. For this step, I used a lot of Vallejo's Mecha Color line, specifically their rust and grime textures. I highly recommend you check out Don Serratos on YouTube. Almost every weathering technique I used on this diorama, I learned from watching his videos. I was feeling a little fancy, and so instead of making my own mud, I decided to try out Vallejo's Thick Mud Diorama Effects. It was a great product to use, although maybe a little spendy. Once the mud was almost dry, I patted the high points down with a sponge just to make it a bit more natural looking, and then laid down my tank tread to leave some tracks. It was a bit of a mess at first, but I quickly realized that if I wet the tank tread down first pulling it out of the mud was a lot easier and left a much cleaner imprint. The next day after the mud had completely dried, I used some old bass guitar strings to act as some thick gauge cabling coming off the moisture evaporators and into the wall panel. I then covered the cables with a bit of mud just to make everything look a little more realistic. I also did one final test to make sure all my lighting still worked. Okay, in the last shot, you may have noticed that little glowing control panel next to the door, and I wanted to do a special highlight of that process, since it's an idea I had and didn't know if I'd be able to make a reality. To start, I printed the control panel in clear resin and then dyed the buttons with a bit of alcohol ink. I clear coated the panel once the ink had dried, and then liquid masked just the buttons. From there I did a base coat of black and then dry brushed a metallic. I also did some chalk weathering and a bit of rust using Vallejo's Mecha colors. Once it was dry, I removed the liquid mask, and thankfully, it worked perfectly on the first try. Okay, before I could add the greenery, I had to glue down a few of the accessories I had been working on, and also add a bit more weathering to a few key areas on the diorama. First the door, which got a brown wash to make it a bit more dirty looking, and then the mud got black and brown and gray washes just to add a bit more tonal variation to the surface of the mud. In my opinion, one of the best ways to add realistic greenery to your diorama is just to have a bunch of different types, textures, and tones. In any real forested environment, there could be hundreds of different types of plant life. And while I can't go that far, I can at least give that impression by cramming every nook and cranny with as many textures of greenery as possible. I have a bunch of this homemade fine turf left over from my Endor diorama a few months ago, and I used that for my moss layer. I just mixed it with a little bit of matte Mod Podge, and then brushed or scooped it into the places I wanted it to be. I used a couple different colors of that homemade turf on the ridge of the mountain, and then used various brown, green, and yellow washes to go back over and give the grass and the moss a bit more tonal variation. To give the machinery a bit more of a grungy, weathered look, I used Vallejo's Streaking Grime and a few of their oil and fuel stain colors from their Mecha color line. These oil and fuel stains dry glossy, and they really helped add a bit more dimension to the machinery's weathering. To sell the look of real wet mud, I used Vallejo's water effects. I mixed it with a little bit of brown paint just to make sure that the mixture was not completely clear, and then spread it all over the mud and a little bit on the moss and up the machinery, just giving everything a nice coat of gloss. Once that first layer was completely dry, I added a bit more paint into the mixture and very carefully dabbed it into all the low points of the tank treads. And then once that was dry, I ran a single flickering LED up a copper tube that would act as the support for the droid. I glued all my creatures into place, and then it was time for the final steps on the droid. Unfortunately, after a coat of primer and then paint, my panel lines were beginning to disappear. So I very carefully removed the styrene overcoat and bought a special engraving tool that allowed me to engrave slightly thicker panel lines. I reassembled the droid off camera, and then it was on to liquid masking. I used the liquid mask to add paint chipping, but also to protect a few of the panels that I did not want any more paint on. Once the liquid mask was dry, I set to work painting the head orange. It took me a couple coats before the orange paint was mostly uniform, and I specifically stopped at mostly uniform, since I did want a little bit of variation to add to the texture of the weathering. Once I had removed the liquid mask, I felt like I sort of overdid it on the paint chipping, and so off camera, I took a sponge and some more orange paint and went back over the white to kind of tone back some of that chipping. Before doing my final passes of washes and weathering, I installed the tiny little metallic parts from the Bondi kit. At this point, everything felt like it was really coming together, and I was really excited. For my panel lining and wash, I mixed a combination of Vallejo's brown wash and gray wash. I made sure to wipe most of it away, but then always came back and made sure every panel line was filled. The wash tends to dry a bit lighter, but as long as you've got the wash in all of your panel lines, it still gives a really nice definition to each of your panels. Remember that little brass panel that I paid $30 for? Well, here it is finally coming into play. I painted it black and then glued it to a little piece of Vallejo's water effects that I tinted blue. I then covered that in a coat of gloss varnish. Once that was dry, I glued it in place, and now I had a tiny little working light panel. I also installed the transparent red sprue from earlier. The final step was to add one last layer of gunk and mud using Vallejo's weathering powder and mud effects. While I'm working on this last little bit, I'll do my closing speech now, since I'm trying out a slightly different format for the final shots. It's very rare when a project goes completely to plan with very little roadblocks along the way, and even rarer still when a project ends up better than you planned it. That's how I feel about this project. I started working on this build back in November, and my goal was for it to be a singular display for all the skills I've learned in this past year, and as far as I'm concerned, I think I accomplished that goal. At every turn in this project, I basically asked myself, what's the most complicated way to do this step? And even though I know it's not truly perfect, I'm very proud of the fact that I stuck to it despite some points feeling pretty daunting. I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody who's watched and commented over this last year. I appreciate you guys. Have a good day.
RLO3, Recon, Logistics and Operations. Nicknamed Arlo, this RL series astromech droid was deployed to Nor Erin, a muddy, rain-soaked planet once home to an Imperial encampment. Dense forests and persistent downpours have since reclaimed the abandoned base, making the terrain treacherous and unforgiving. Arlo's single-threaded leg and gyroscopic stabilizer allowed him to navigate the ruins and the overgrown wilderness with precision. Tasked by the New Republic with reconnaissance after the fall of the second Death Star, Arlo was to catalog surviving Imperial technology, map the encampment's remains, and monitor the planet's environmental recovery. However, due to a bureaucratic oversight in the burgeoning new government, Arlo's retrieval never occurred, leaving him alone on Nor Erin for over 3 decades. Despite the isolation, Arlo continued his mission, dutifully maintaining logs, salvaging equipment, and maintaining critical energy systems to ensure his survival. Over time, he expanded his scope, documenting the vibrant resurgence of Nor Erin's ecosystem alongside the fading remnants of Imperial presence. His memory banks became an archive of both natural renewal and forgotten history. When rediscovered by a New Republic survey team, Arlo's logs provided detailed intelligence on Imperial operations and a unique record of Nor Erin's transformation. Now displayed at the Galactic Museum of History, Arlo's story is celebrated as a testament to the resilience and loyalty of droids. His holographic records give visitors a hauntingly beautiful glimpse into the interplay between war, abandonment, and nature's enduring strength.